The crisp October morning brought hundreds of tourists to the gates of Buckingham Palace, their cameras ready to capture the iconic changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Jessica Matthews, a 28-year-old social media influencer from Los Angeles who had flown to London specifically to create content. For her 3 million followers, she wore designer clothes, carried expensive equipment, and had the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Wherever she went, Jessica had built her online empire by creating controversial content that often pushed boundaries and sometimes crossed lines of basic human decency. Her followers loved her bold personality and willingness to do things others wouldn't dare attempt. She specialized in pranks, public confrontations, and situations that generated maximum engagement through shock value rather than genuine entertainment. Standing near the palace gates was guard William Sterling, a 32-year-old veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before earning his place among the Queen's Guard. William came from a humble background in Yorkshire, where his father worked as a coal miner and his mother as a school cleaner. Military service had given him purpose, discipline, and a deep sense of pride in serving his country. The red uniform he wore represented years of training, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to duty. William had been standing motionless at his post for nearly 2 hours, his face expressionless beneath the iconic bearskin hat. His military training had taught him to ignore distractions, maintain perfect posture, and remain alert to any potential security threats while tourists photographed him and occasionally attempted to make him react. He had learned to tune out the constant chatter, camera clicks, and occasional inappropriate comments from visitors who seemed to forget that he was a real person doing a serious job. Jessica noticed William immediately and saw an opportunity for viral content. She had researched royal guards before her trip and knew they were trained never to react to provocation. In her mind, this made them perfect targets for the kind of content that would generate millions of views and hundreds of thousands of comments. She positioned her camera equipment and began recording, already planning the caption that would accompany her post. "Look at this guy," Jessica announced loudly to her camera, ensuring her voice carried across the courtyard. "Standing there like some kind of toy soldier. I bet he's not even real." She laughed at her own joke, encouraging the small crowd that had gathered around her to join in the entertainment she was providing. William heard every word but remained perfectly still. His training had prepared him for this type of situation. Tourists regularly tried to provoke reactions from guards, and the professional response was always the same: maintain composure, ignore the distraction, focus on duty. He had dealt with far worse than rude tourists during his military service, and nothing this woman could say would break his concentration. But Jessica was just getting started. She moved closer to William, positioning herself directly in front of him while her camera recorded every moment. "I wonder if he's actually breathing," she said, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Maybe they just stuffed these uniforms and put them out here for decoration. Would anyone even notice if this one was missing?" The crowd around Jessica grew larger as other tourists became interested in her performance. Some laughed uncomfortably, others seemed genuinely amused, and a few appeared disturbed by her behavior but said nothing. Jessica thrived on the attention, feeding off the energy of her impromptu audience as she continued her harassment of the guards. "Sir," she called out in an exaggerated voice, "can you hear me in there? Are you alive? Blink once for yes, twice for no." She waved her hands dramatically in front of William's face, coming dangerously close to making physical contact. Her camera captured every gesture, every mocking expression, every moment of what she considered comedy gold. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his position. Years of military service had taught him discipline that went beyond anything most civilians could comprehend. He had stood guard in hostile territory where a moment's distraction could mean death. A rude tourist with a camera was nothing compared to the challenges he had faced in service to his country. Jessica pulled out her phone and began taking selfies with William in the background, making exaggerated faces and poses while narrating for her followers. "Getting some pics with London's most boring man," she announced. "I think he's actually a statue. The British are so cheap they just put up fake guards now." Her comments grew more personal and insulting as she realized the guard wasn't reacting to her initial provocations. She began making jokes about his appearance, his job, and what she imagined his life must be like. Each comment was calculated to be more offensive than the last, designed to either provoke a reaction or create content that would generate outrage and engagement on social media. "I bet this guy lives in his mom's basement," Jessica continued, circling around William like a predator stalking prey. "Standing here all day playing dress-up soldier. What a pathetic way to spend your life. I make more money in a week than this loser probably makes in a year." Some tourists began to look uncomfortable with Jessica's behavior, but none intervened. The bystander effect was in full display as people watched the harassment continue without taking action to stop it. A few took out their own phones to record the scene, though whether they were documenting it for entertainment or evidence wasn't clear. William's military background had exposed him to real hardship, genuine sacrifice, and life-threatening situations that had shaped his character in ways Jessica couldn't begin to understand. He thought about his fellow soldiers who hadn't made it home, about the families who had lost loved ones in service to their country, about the honor and dignity that his uniform represented. Her words stung not because they were true, but because they showed such complete disrespect for everything he and his colleagues stood for. Jessica moved even closer, now speaking directly into William's face while her camera recorded from multiple angles. "Wake up, sleeping beauty. The tourists want to see some action. Do something interesting for once in your miserable life." Her behavior had crossed every line of basic human decency, but she was too caught up in creating content to consider the impact of her actions on the real person standing before her. In her mind, William was just a prop for her entertainment, a costume-wearing performer whose feelings didn't matter as long as she got the footage she wanted. What Jessica didn't know was that William had recently learned some devastating news that made her casual cruelty cut especially deep. His younger brother James, who had also served in the military, had been diagnosed with a serious illness that would require expensive treatment. William had been working extra shifts and saving every penny to help support his brother's medical costs, making Jessica's comments about his financial situation particularly painful. The crowd continued to grow as word spread through the tourist groups that something entertaining was happening near the palace gates. Jessica basked in the attention, believing she was creating the kind of viral content that would boost her follower count and generate significant advertising revenue. She had no idea that her actions were being recorded by security cameras throughout the area or that her behavior would soon have consequences. She never could have imagined that. Jessica prepared to escalate her harassment even further, completely unaware that she was about to cross a line that would change her life forever. William remained motionless at his post, but beneath his stoic exterior, something was building, a quiet resolve that would soon manifest in ways that Jessica's followers would never forget. Jessica's harassment reached a new level as she became increasingly frustrated by William's lack of response. Her initial mockery had evolved into something more aggressive and personal, driven by her need to create increasingly shocking content for her social media empire. She had built her career on pushing boundaries, and William's professional composure only made her more determined to break through his defenses. "Maybe he's deaf too," Jessica announced loudly to her growing audience, which now included dozens of tourists who had stopped to watch her performance. "That would explain why he's not responding to anything I'm saying. Hey, deaf boy." She clapped her hands inches from William's face, the sound echoing sharply across the courtyard. William's training had prepared him for many situations, but the sustained personal attack he was enduring tested even his exceptional discipline. He focused on his breathing, on his duty, on the honor of the uniform he wore. He thought about his fellow guards who were depending on him to maintain the dignity of their service, about the tourists who had come to witness a piece of British tradition, about the responsibility he carried as a representative of his country. Jessica pulled out props she had brought specifically for creating content: a rubber chicken, oversized sunglasses, and a foam finger. She began staging increasingly elaborate scenes around William, treating him like an inanimate object rather than a human being. "Look, everyone, I'm more interesting than this statue," she called out, dancing around him while making exaggerated gestures for her camera. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some tourists laughed uncomfortably, caught between entertainment and embarrassment at witnessing such behavior. Others began to mutter among themselves about whether someone should intervene. A few families with young children moved away from the scene, not wanting their kids to witness such disrespectful behavior toward a service member. An elderly British gentleman named Arthur Pemberton, a World War II veteran visiting London with his granddaughter, watched Jessica's performance with growing disgust. He had served alongside men like William, understood the sacrifice and dedication required for military service, and recognized the profound disrespect being shown. He leaned on his walking stick and spoke quietly to his granddaughter about the importance of treating service members with dignity and respect. Jessica, oblivious to the changing mood around her, continued her harassment with increasing intensity. She began making up stories about William for her camera, creating fictional scenarios about his life that grew more insulting with each iteration. "I bet this guy was the kid everyone picked on in school," she narrated. "Now he's found the perfect job where he doesn't have to think or talk or do anything useful, just stand there and collect a paycheck for being a decoration." What Jessica didn't realize was that several people in the crowd had begun recording her behavior, not for entertainment but as evidence of what they considered unacceptable harassment. A British businessman named David Mitchell discreetly filmed from the back of the crowd, planning to report the incident to palace security. A teacher from Manchester named Sarah Collins documented Jessica's actions while explaining to her own children why such behavior was inappropriate. William's thoughts drifted to his brother James, who was currently in a hospital bed fighting for his life. James had always looked up to William, had followed him into military service, had shared his deep respect for duty and honor. The idea that his service was being mocked by someone who had never sacrificed anything for anyone else felt like a personal attack, not just on him, but on his brother and everyone who had served alongside them. Jessica's behavior grew even more outrageous as she realized her follower count was climbing in real. People were sharing her live stream, commenting with fire emojis and laughing faces, encouraging her to push further. The instant gratification of social media validation drove her to new levels of inappropriate behavior. "Maybe if I touch him, he'll finally react," Jessica announced, reaching toward William's uniform. Several people in the crowd gasped, understanding that she was about to cross a serious line. Touching a royal guard without permission wasn't just disrespectful, it was potentially illegal and could be considered assault. Before Jessica's hand could make contact, a firm voice cut through the courtyard air. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back from the guard." Palace security officer, Inspector James Morrison, approached the scene, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the situation. Jessica turned toward the security officer with the same dismissive attitude she had shown William. "Oh, come on. I'm just having some fun with the statue here. He doesn't seem to mind." She gestured casually toward William as if he were an inanimate object rather than a person who had been enduring her harassment. "For nearly an hour, the guard is performing official duties," Inspector Morrison explained firmly but professionally. "Your behavior is interfering with his ability to do his job and is disturbing other visitors. I need you to move along." Jessica's expression shifted from dismissive to indignant. She had encountered resistance to her content creation before and knew how to handle officials who tried to limit her artistic expression. "I'm a professional content creator with millions of followers," she declared loudly, as if her social media status granted her special privileges. "I'm documenting British culture for my audience. This is educational content." The inspector remained calm but firm. "Ma'am, you're not documenting culture. You're harassing a service member. This behavior stops now, or you'll be escorted from the premises." Jessica's camera was still rolling, capturing her confrontation with palace security. She saw this as even better content than her original harassment of the guard. "Are you seriously going to arrest me for taking pictures? This is a public space. I have rights." What Jessica didn't understand was that while the area outside Buckingham Palace was accessible to the public, it wasn't a free-for-all where any behavior was acceptable. There were rules, regulations, and standards of conduct that applied to everyone, regardless of their social media status or American citizenship. Inspector Morrison had dealt with difficult tourists before, but Jessica's sense of entitlement and complete lack of awareness about her inappropriate behavior struck him as particularly problematic. He could see the effect her harassment was having not just on William, but on the other tourists who were trying to enjoy their visit to one of Britain's most important historical sites. "Ma'am, you have two choices," the inspector said clearly. "You can voluntarily move along and continue your visit to London elsewhere, or we can involve the Metropolitan Police and discuss this matter in a more formal setting." Jessica looked around at the crowd, expecting support from the tourists who had been watching her performance. Instead, she saw expressions of disapproval, embarrassment, and in some cases, outright hostility toward her behavior. The mood had shifted dramatically from the beginning of her harassment campaign, and she was finally beginning to realize that her actions weren't being received as positively as she had assumed. "Fine, whatever," Jessica said dismissively, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "This place is boring anyway. Come on, London, show me something interesting." As she began to pack up her equipment, still streaming live to her followers, Jessica had no idea that her behavior had been thoroughly documented by palace security cameras, multiple tourists, and law enforcement officers who had been discreetly observing the situation. She assumed she was walking away from a minor confrontation with overly serious officials who didn't appreciate good entertainment. William remained at his post throughout the entire exchange, never breaking his professional composure despite the intense personal stress of the situation. As Jessica finally moved away from his position, he felt a small sense of relief, but also a growing awareness that this incident was far from over. The way she had filmed everything, the casual cruelty of her behavior, and her complete lack of remorse suggested that this woman was about to face consequences she couldn't even imagine. The seed of those consequences had already been planted in the minds of everyone who had witnessed her behavior, and soon they would begin to grow in ways that would forever change Jessica's understanding of how actions have repercussions, especially when those actions are broadcast to millions of people around the world. Jessica left Buckingham Palace feeling confident about the content she had created, completely unaware that her live stream had captured not just her harassment of William, but also the disgusted reactions of everyone around her. She spent the rest of her day exploring London, posting additional content to her social media accounts and basking in what she perceived as another successful day of viral content creation. By evening, Jessica was back in her luxury hotel room, editing the footage from her palace visit. She planned to create multiple posts from the material: short clips for TikTok, longer videos for YouTube, and a series of Instagram stories that would keep her followers engaged for days. As she reviewed the footage, she felt particularly proud of her persistence in trying to get a reaction from the guard, seeing it as evidence of her creativity and determination. What Jessica didn't know was that her live stream had been captured and saved by dozens of viewers who had been horrified by her behavior. Within hours of her palace visit, clips of her harassment were being shared across multiple platforms, but not in the way she had intended. Instead of celebrating her boldness, viewers were expressing outrage at her treatment of the guard. Sarah Collins, the teacher from Manchester who had witnessed the incident, was the first to post a response video. "I watched this American influencer spend an hour verbally abusing a British service member today," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "This man was doing his job, serving his country with dignity, and she treated him like he was less than human. This isn't entertainment, it's cruelty." Sarah's video, which included footage she had discreetly filmed of Jessica's behavior, was shared thousands of times within the first few hours. Other witnesses began coming forward with their own recordings and testimonials about what they had observed. Arthur Pemberton, the World War II veteran, was interviewed by his local newspaper about the incident, his words carrying the weight of someone who had served alongside men like William. "That young woman has no understanding of what service means," Arthur said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "She mocked a man who has likely risked his life for his country, who stands at that post with honor and dignity. Her behavior was a disgrace, and I hope she faces appropriate consequences for it." The British media picked up the story quickly. The Daily Mail, The Guardian, and BBC News all began investigating the incident. Reaching out to palace security and interviewing witnesses, the story wasn't just about one rude tourist. It had become a symbol of the broader cultural clash between social media, influencer culture, and traditional values of respect and decency. Meanwhile, Jessica was completely oblivious to the growing storm around her actions. She posted her edited videos with captions like "trying to wake up London's sleepiest soldier" and "British guards are so serious." She expected the usual mix of engagements and criticism from sensitive viewers, lots of support from her loyal followers, and the overall boost to her profile that came from controversial content. Instead, the response was unlike anything she had experienced in her career. The comments on her posts were overwhelmingly negative, with thousands of people expressing disgust at her behavior. British users were particularly vocal, explaining the significance of the Royal Guards and the disrespect she had shown to military service members. "This is absolutely disgusting," wrote one user. "That guard is a real person with a real job serving his country. You treated him like an object for your entertainment. Shameful. I hope you're proud of yourself for harassing a service member," commented another. "This isn't funny or entertaining, it's cruel and pathetic." The criticism wasn't limited to random social media users. British celebrities, military veterans, and public figures began sharing the videos with their own condemnations of Jessica's behavior. A popular British comedian with 5 million followers posted, "Imagine thinking it's funny to mock someone who's dedicated their life to serving their country." This American influencer represents everything wrong with social media culture. Jessica's follower count, which she monitored obsessively, began to plummet for the first time in her career. She was losing thousands of followers every hour as people discovered her content through the controversy and decided they wanted nothing to do with someone who would treat a service member so disrespectfully. The palace communications team, meanwhile, was dealing with an unprecedented situation. While they couldn't comment specifically on individual incidents involving guards, they found themselves fielding hundreds of media inquiries about Jessica's behavior and the broader issue of tourist harassment of service members. William Sterling, still unaware of the viral nature of his harassment, continued his duties at the palace. His fellow guards and superiors were aware of what had happened, and there was a growing sense of support for him within the military community. Word was spreading through military networks about the American influencer who had spent an hour mocking one of their own. Jessica's first indication that something was seriously wrong came when major news outlets began reaching out to her for comment. CNN, Fox News, and BBC journalists were all requesting interviews about her incident at Buckingham Palace. I assumed this was positive attention. Major media coverage could be excellent for her brand. Her manager, Derek Phillips, called her in a panic. "Jessica, what the hell did you do in London? My phone hasn't stopped ringing with reporters asking about some video of you harassing a British guard. They're not calling because they want to celebrate you, they're calling because you're becoming international news for all the wrong reasons." Jessica pulled up her social media accounts and began scrolling through the responses to her palace content. For the first time, she saw the full scope of the backlash she had created. The comments weren't just critical, they were furious. People were calling her a bully, demanding she apologize, and sharing information about the importance and sacrifice of military service members. "It's not that bad," Jessica said to Derek, though her voice carried less confidence than usual. "People always get upset when I push boundaries. This will blow over in a few days like it always does." But Derek had been monitoring the situation more closely than Jessica realized. "This isn't like your usual controversies. British military veterans are organizing boycotts of your sponsors. The hashtag #RespectOurGuards hashtag is trending internationally. Someone started a petition demanding you be banned from the UK that already has 50,000 signatures." Jessica felt the first real stirring of concern. She had dealt with backlash before, but this felt different. The criticism wasn't just coming from the usual suspects who disapproved of her content. It was coming from people who had never heard of her before but were outraged by what they saw as a fundamental lack of human decency. Her phone buzzed with a notification from Instagram. One of her major sponsors, a fashion company that paid her 6 figures annually for promotional posts, had sent a message requesting an urgent conversation about her recent content. Similar messages began arriving from other brands she worked with, all expressing concern about their association with her in light of the palace incident. Jessica's confidence began to crack as she realized the full implications of what was happening. This wasn't just another controversy that would boost her engagement and ultimately help her career. This was something that threatened the very foundation of her business, her reputation, and her carefully constructed online empire. She began frantically researching the man she had harassed, trying to understand why the response had been so severe. What she discovered made her stomach drop. William Sterling wasn't just any guard. He was a decorated veteran who had served multiple tours in Afghanistan. A man whose service record included commendations for bravery and dedication. She had mocked someone who had literally risked his life for his country, treating him like a prop in her entertainment show. As Jessica sat in her London hotel room, watching her career implode in real time, she began to understand that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The consequences of her actions were just beginning to unfold, and they would prove to be more severe and long-lasting than anything she could have imagined. 6 months after the incident at Buckingham Palace, the consequences of Jessica's actions had crystallized into a permanent transformation of her life that she could never have imagined. When she first pointed her camera at William Sterling, she sat in a small studio apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Los Angeles, a far cry from the luxury penthouse she had once called home, staring at her phone screen that displayed the final notification that would end this chapter of her life forever. The Crown Prosecution Service had accepted her plea agreement. Rather than face a public trial that would have resulted in certain conviction and possible jail time, Jessica had agreed to plead guilty to harassment charges, pay substantial fines, and accept a 10-year ban from entering the United Kingdom. The legal document that arrived by certified mail made it official. She was now a convicted criminal whose actions had been formally condemned by the British legal system. Her attorney had negotiated the best possible outcome under the circumstances, but the reality of having a criminal record for harassing a military veteran would follow Jessica for the rest of her life. Background checks for employment, housing applications, and any professional opportunities would now reveal her conviction, ensuring that the consequences of her behavior would extend far beyond the immediate financial and social devastation she had already experienced. Jessica's former social media empire had completely collapsed. Her Instagram account, which had once boasted 3 million followers, now had fewer than 50,000, most of whom followed her only to continue criticizing her actions. Her YouTube channel had been demonetized after multiple policy violations, and TikTok had permanently banned her account following the harassment incident. The digital platforms that had once been her source of wealth and fame now served only as monuments to her fall from grace. The woman who had once commanded 6-figure sponsorship deals was now working night shifts at a 24-hour diner, earning minimum wage to pay rent on her tiny apartment. Her co-workers had no idea about her former fame, and Jessica preferred it that way. The few times she had been recognized in public had resulted in confrontations with people who remembered her treatment of the British Guard, forcing her to live under constant fear of being identified and condemned. Her family relationships had never recovered. Jessica's parents had changed their phone number and refused all contact with their daughter, unable to reconcile the cruel person they had seen in the viral videos with the child they had raised. Her siblings had blocked her on all social media platforms and made it clear that she was no longer welcome at family gatherings. The isolation was complete and seemed permanent. Meanwhile, William Sterling's life had taken a dramatically different trajectory. The international support generated by his dignified response to Jessica's harassment had not only funded his brother, James's complete recovery, but it also opened unexpected opportunities for both brothers. James's successful treatment had been so remarkable that he had become a poster child for the experimental therapy, helping other families understand their options when facing similar diagnosis. William himself had been approached by military leadership about taking on a new role as a spokesperson for veteran affairs and military dignity. His calm professionalism during the harassment incident had made him a symbol of service member resilience, and his story was being used in training programs to teach both military personnel and civilians about maintaining composure under pressure. Sterling Brothers had established a charitable foundation, using the excess funds from their crowdfunding campaign, specifically focused on helping military families access medical care for rare conditions. The foundation, which they named Dignity in Service, had already assisted over 100 families, and had attracted support from corporate sponsors and government agencies. Impressed by the brothers' integrity and mission, my brother's harassment became an opportunity to help others. James Sterling said during a television interview marking the 6-month anniversary of the incident, "That woman thought she was mocking a statue, but she ended up revealing the true character of someone who serves with honor." The response from people around the world showed that most people still value dignity and respect. William, who rarely spoke publicly about the incident, had agreed to a single interview with the BBC about the lasting impact of that October morning. "I never expected my worst day on duty to become something that could help so many other families," he said quietly. "The support we received taught me that standing up for what's right, even silently, can inspire others to do the same." The broader cultural impact of Jessica's actions had extended far beyond her personal consequences. The incident had sparked conversations about influencer culture, the dehumanization of people for entertainment content, and the importance of treating service members with respect. Several social media platforms had updated their community guidelines specifically to address harassment of military personnel and public servants. Universities had begun using Jessica's case as a study in digital ethics courses, examining how the pursuit of viral content could lead to serious legal and personal consequences. The incident had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating real people as props for entertainment, with Jessica herself serving as an example of how quickly online fame could transform into lasting infamy. The legal precedent set by Jessica's conviction had empowered other harassment victims to seek justice through the courts. Several similar cases involving influencers targeting public servants and military personnel had been successfully prosecuted using the framework established by the Sterling case. Jessica's actions had inadvertently strengthened legal protections for people performing public duties. Jessica's attempts to rebuild any kind of public presence had failed completely. Her conviction had made her unemployable in any media-related field, and her reputation was so toxic that even sympathetic employers were unwilling to risk the negative publicity that would come from hiring her. She had effectively been erased from the industry she had once dominated. The diner where Jessica worked closed at 6 in the morning, and she would walk home through empty streets, invisible to a world that had once hung on her every post. The woman who had once commanded the attention of millions now lived in complete anonymity. Her only interactions, the brief exchanges required by her minimum wage job. In quiet moments, Jessica sometimes reflected on the path that had led her to this point. She could trace the gradual erosion of her empathy as her follower count grew, the way she had begun to see people as content opportunities rather than human beings deserving of respect. The god she had mocked had been just another prop in her mind, no different from the inanimate objects she used for her staged videos. William Sterling had given her exactly what she thought she wanted: fame that reached millions of people around the world. But instead of celebrating her boldness and creativity, those millions had seen something that disgusted them: a person who had lost touch with basic human decency in the pursuit of online validation. Jessica's phone buzzed with a news alert about William Sterling receiving a commendation from the Queen for his exemplary service and charitable work. The article included a photo of William and James at a ceremony celebrating the first anniversary of their foundation, both men healthy and smiling, surrounded by families they had helped through their organization. The contrast between their success and her isolation was stark and permanent. William had transformed the worst moment of his career into an opportunity to serve others, while Jessica had transformed what she thought was a moment of creative triumph into the destruction of everything she had built. As Jessica put her phone away and prepared for another lonely evening in her studio apartment, she finally understood the complete cost of treating another human being as entertainment. The guard she had mocked for an hour had shown more character in his silence than she had demonstrated in her entire public career. His dignity had elevated him, while her cruelty had destroyed her. The story that began with Jessica believing she could mock a British guard for fun had ended with her learning that some actions carry consequences that last forever, and that respect for human dignity isn't just a nice ideal, it's the foundation of a life worth living. William Sterling had taught the world that lesson through his example, while Jessica Matthews had learned it through the complete destruction of everything she once held dear. Of Jessica's harassment had created something unprecedented in the influencer world. Usually, controversial content generated mixed reactions, some outrage, some support, and ultimately increased engagement that benefited everyone involved. This time, the reaction was almost universally creating a toxic association that no brand wanted to touch. Major news networks had begun running segments about Jessica's behavior as part of broader discussions about influencer culture, social media responsibility, and respect for service members. CNN interviewed military veterans who expressed their disgust at her treatment of William Sterling. Fox News ran a segment titled "Influencer Culture Gone Wrong" that used Jessica's video as the example of everything problematic about social media. Celebrity. The BBC produced a documentary-style piece that contrasted Jessica's mockery with interviews featuring British veterans discussing the significance of military service and the respect traditionally shown to guards at royal occasions. The piece didn't mention Jessica by name, but everyone who watched understood exactly what had inspired the segment. William Sterling himself had become an unexpected symbol of dignity and professionalism. Military support groups had begun sharing his story, highlighting his service record and the respectful way he had handled Jessica's harassment. A crowdfunding campaign started by British veterans to support William and his brother James's medical expenses had raised over £100,000 in just 2 days. Jessica's attempts to control the narrative were failing spectacularly. She posted what she thought was a clever response video, suggesting that people were overreacting to harmless fun and that she had brought international attention to British culture. The response was even more brutal than the original backlash. "She still doesn't get it," commented one user. "This isn't about cultural exchange or entertainment. This is about basic human decency and respect for people who serve their country." A British military wife posted a video response that went viral within hours. "My husband has served 3 tours overseas," she said, tears in her eyes. "When he comes home, he serves as a royal guard, standing in that uniform with pride and dignity. Watching someone mock him for doing his job, treating him like he's not even human, breaks my heart. This isn't entertainment, it's cruelty." Jessica's hometown newspaper in Los Angeles picked up the story, interviewing her high school teachers and former classmates about her behavior. The picture that emerged wasn't flattering. Former friends described her as someone who had always pushed boundaries for attention, but who had lost touch with basic empathy as her social media fame grew. "She used to be different," said her former college roommate in an interview with a local news station. "Success changed her. She started seeing people as content opportunities rather than actual human beings. What she did to that guard is horrible, but unfortunately it's not surprising to those of us who knew her before she became famous." The psychological toll on Jessica was becoming evident to those around her. Derek noticed that she had stopped eating regularly, was sleeping poorly, and seemed to be in a constant state of anxiety as she watched her career implode. Her trademark confidence had been replaced by a desperate scrambling to find some way to salvage her reputation and income. "Maybe I should go back to London and apologize," Jessica suggested during one of her crisis meetings with Derek. "I could make a public apology video at the palace that show that I understand why people are upset." Derek looked at her incredulously. "Jessica, you're being investigated by the Metropolitan Police for harassment. Going back to London right now would be the worst possible decision. We're trying to keep this from becoming a criminal matter, not make it worse." Jessica had been so focused on the financial and professional consequences that she hadn't fully grasped the legal implications of her actions. Harassment laws in the UK were taken seriously, especially when they involved service members performing official duties. The volume of complaints filed with both palace security and local police had triggered a formal investigation. Inspector Morrison, the security officer who had intervened during Jessica's harassment of William, had filed a comprehensive report that included testimony from multiple witnesses and hours of video evidence from both security cameras and tourist recordings. The case was being reviewed by prosecutors who were considering whether formal charges should be filed. "The Crown Prosecution Service is looking at charges of harassment, public disorder, and interfering with official duties," Derek explained, reading from a legal document that had been served at Jessica's hotel. "If they decide to proceed, you could be facing significant fines, a criminal record, and a permanent ban from entering the United Kingdom." The reality of potential criminal prosecution hit Jessica harder than any of the financial losses. She had built her entire identity around being a fearless content creator who pushed boundaries, but the possibility of actually facing legal consequences for her actions had never seemed real before. Her social media accounts, once sources of constant validation and income, who had become platforms for relentless criticism. Every post she made was flooded with comments demanding apologies, sharing information about military service, and expressing support for William Sterling. Her attempt to pivot to other content was unsuccessful. Everything she posted was viewed through the lens of her palace behavior. The petition to ban Jessica from the UK had grown to over 200,000 signatures, with supporters including veterans, organizations, military families, and ordinary citizens who had been appalled by her behavior. Members of Parliament had begun discussing whether existing laws were sufficient to protect service members from this type of harassment. Jessica found herself trapped in her London hotel room, afraid to go outside because she had been recognized by several people who confronted her about her behavior. Paparazzi had begun following her, hoping to capture her reaction to the growing scandal. The woman who had once thrived on attention now found herself desperate to escape the very spotlight she had worked so hard to create. As Jessica sat in her hotel room, watching news segments about her behavior and reading the thousands of comments condemning her actions, she began to understand that she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The career she had spent years building was collapsing. The reputation she had carefully crafted was in ruins, and the legal system was considering holding her accountable for treating another human being as entertainment rather than recognizing his dignity and service. The full weight of her actions was finally beginning to sink in, but the consequences were far from over. 2 weeks after the incident at Buckingham Palace, Jessica received the news she had been dreading. The Crown Prosecution Service had decided to move forward with formal charges against her for harassment and public disorder. The legal notice arrived at her Los Angeles home, where she had fled after her disastrous London trip, hoping that distance might help her escape the consequences of her actions. Her new legal team, which had cost her the last of her savings to hire, explained the severity of her situation during a tense video conference call. "Ms. Matthews, the British authorities have a very strong case," said attorney Richard Stevenson. a specialist in international legal matters. They have multiple hours of video evidence, dozens of witness statements, and testimony from law enforcement officers who witnessed your behavior firsthand. Jessica had lost over 30 pounds since the palace incident, her face gaunt with stress and her once confident demeanor replaced by barely contained panic. Her social media accounts, which had been her primary source of income and identity, were now abandoned wastelands of negative comments and calls for accountability. Every attempt she made to post new content was met with immediate backlash referencing her treatment of William Sterling. "What are my options?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman who had once commanded attention from millions of followers now seemed small and defeated, a shadow of her former self. "You have three choices," Attorney Stevenson explained grimly. "You can fight the charges in court, which will require you to return to London and face a very public trial that you'll likely lose. You can attempt to negotiate a plea agreement that would involve admitting guilt and accepting punishment, or you can ignore the charges and accept that you'll never be able to travel to the UK or most European Union countries again without being arrested." Meanwhile, in London, William Sterling had been quietly dealing with his own complex emotions about becoming the center of an international controversy. The crowdfunding campaign for his brother James's medical treatment had exceeded all expectations, raising over £300,000 from supporters around the world who had been moved by his dignity in the face of Jessica's harassment. William's commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Agus, had called him into her office to discuss the unprecedented situation. "Sterling, I want you to know that the entire regiment is proud of how you handled yourself during that incident. Your professionalism under extreme provocation exemplified everything we value about the Queen's Guard." "Thank you, ma'am," William replied, though his expression remained troubled. "I have to admit, I never expected my private struggle would become so public. The support for James's treatment has been overwhelming, but I can't help feeling uncomfortable with all the attention." Colonel Hayes nodded understandingly. "The public's response shows that people still recognize and value genuine service and dignity." That woman thought she could mock what you represent, but instead she reminded everyone why we honor military service. "Your brother's treatment is now fully funded, and you've become a symbol of everything positive about dedication to duty." Contrast between William's quiet dignity and Jessica's desperate attempts to salvage her reputation couldn't have been more stark. While William continued his duties with the same professionalism he had always shown, Jessica was spiraling into increasingly erratic behavior as she watched her life collapse. Her attempts at damage control had become increasingly desperate and tone-deaf. She hired a public relations firm that specialized in crisis management, paying them $50,000 to craft an apology strategy. Their first recommendation was a carefully scripted video apology that would acknowledge her mistakes while positioning her as someone who had learned from the experience. The resulting video was a disaster. Jessica's apology felt hollow and scripted, focusing more on how the backlash had affected her than on the harm she had caused William. She spoke about losing sponsorships and followers, about the stress of negative attention, about how she had been misunderstood by people who didn't appreciate her creative process. "I never intended to hurt anyone," Jessica said in the video, tears streaming down her face in what appeared to be a calculated display of emotion. "I was just trying to create entertaining content for my followers. I didn't realize how seriously people would take it." The response to her apology video was swift and brutal. Military veterans posted response videos explaining why her apology missed the point entirely. British citizens expressed outrage that she seemed more concerned about her lost income than the dignity of the service member she had harassed. Even her former supporters began abandoning her, disgusted by what they saw as a selfish and insincere attempt to minimize her actions. "She still doesn't get it," wrote one commenter whose response received thousands of likes. "This isn't about misunderstanding or creative content. This is about treating another human being like garbage for entertainment. Her apology is all about her feelings, not about the person she hurt." The legal pressure continued to mount. British authorities had issued a formal extradition request, though legal experts agreed it was unlikely to be granted for harassment charges. However, the request sent a clear message that Jessica's actions were being taken seriously by the British legal system. Attorney Stevenson delivered more bad news during their next consultation. "The situation has become more complicated. Several other countries have indicated they're reviewing your visa status in light of the charges. Canada and Australia have both suggested they may deny entry based on character concerns. Your ability to travel internationally for any reason is being severely compromised." Jessica's isolation was becoming complete. Her former friends in the influencer community had distanced themselves from her, afraid that association with her would damage their own brands. Sponsors who had once competed for her endorsement now treated her name as toxic. Event organizers who had previously paid her substantial fees to appear at conventions and marketing events had blacklisted her entirely. Her family relationships had also deteriorated. Jessica's parents, who lived quietly in suburban Los Angeles, had been harassed by reporters and faced criticism from their neighbors and community members who recognized their connection to their infamous daughter. Her mother had stopped speaking to her entirely, unable to understand how her daughter had become someone capable of such cruelty. The financial devastation was complete. Jessica had burned through her savings on legal fees and crisis management consultants. Her Los Angeles apartment, which she had purchased at the height of her success, was in foreclosure. The lifestyle she had built on social media fame was unsustainable without the constant income from sponsorships and promotional deals. In a moment of desperation, Jessica attempted to pivot her entire brand around the controversy, positioning herself as a victim of cancel culture who had been unfairly targeted for harmless content creation. She appeared on several podcasts that specialized in hosting controversial figures, trying to reshape the narrative around her actions. These appearances only made her situation worse. When pressed by podcast hosts about the specific details of her behavior toward William Sterling, Jessica's attempts to minimize and justify her actions revealed the same lack of empathy that had created the problem in the first place. Clips from these interviews went viral, but not in the way she had hoped. They served as evidence that she remained unrepentant and focused on her own victim, rather than the harm she had caused. The British media had begun following up on William's story, documenting his brother James's successful treatment and recovery. The contrast between the Sterling family's quiet gratitude and Jessica's public desperation created a powerful narrative about character, dignity, and the consequences of our choices. James Sterling, speaking publicly for the first time since his diagnosis, gave an interview from his hospital bed. "My brother has always been my hero," he said, his voice weak but determined. "Watching how he handled himself when that woman was attacking him reminded me why I've always looked up to him. The support we've received because of his dignity has literally saved my life." As Jessica sat in her nearly empty apartment, facing criminal charges, financial ruin, and complete social isolation, she began to understand the true cost of treating another human being as entertainment. The God she had mocked for an hour had shown more character and strength in his silence than she had demonstrated in her entire career. The consequences of her actions were no longer just professional or financial. They had become a complete reckoning with the person she had become and the values she had abandoned in pursuit of viral fame.